All right, it's 9 o'clock on the dot, so we're going to go ahead and get started. For those just now joining, good morning. I'm Sloan Sorbana, Director of Career Development at your association. I want to start by thanking our friends at Zoom Drain, and Dennis is on with us this morning. They are our sponsors for this morning's session, also participating in our marketplace. So I really encourage you to go visit the marketplace, visit our friends at Zoom. But good morning, Dennis. Tell us a couple things about Zoom this morning.
Good morning. First of all, thank you to WUMFA and you and Trisha. You guys are doing a fantastic job in this new virtual conference world. Great job.
Thank you.
When we wanted a sponsor for sure, and I went down the list looking for a customer, and we serve Thrive, so it was fun to see Kendall on there. And then this topic is a great topic. Zoom Drain. We're anything to do with drains. When your drain's backed up in any way, inside or outside the house, we can handle it. Two cool things about Zoom Drain is our trucks. Our trucks are set up to handle anything. So they've got all the machinery. We've got the sewer cameras, the locators, and the jetters. So we don't have to call in for another visit. So really, it's a one-stop shop visit for anything to do with your drain. And the other thing is our focus really is one call at a time. And so our techs don't have the dispatcher pressuring them to rush to another call. And what that does is it frees our tech up to do their best work, do a really good job, take really good care of your customer, clean up after themselves, leaving things fresh, and it just makes overall a great experience. And so that's probably the coolest thing about Zoom Drain is the way we handle every single customer. It helps make property managers look good. And do go to our booth. If you fill out a contact form, you can get a chance to win 1.75 liters of Kraken. And so I'm really glad to have Sloan take over and introduce Spark to a Flame. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Kraken, wow. We love our Seattle sports teams, and that's a good ode to them. So thank you so much for that, and thank you again for your partnership in this event. All right, so this session today is a little different than any of the ones that we've done throughout the week, and that this is a conversation, and this is the beginning of an ongoing conversation that the association is committed to having within the industry, and we want you to be part of it. So I'm going to start by just introducing our panelists, each of them, and then they're each going to just take a turn sharing their story and how it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then I really encourage you throughout this session to throw questions that you might have for our panelists in the Q&A feature. Please put them in the Q&A and not in the chat so I don't miss them. And we will have time at the end of the session to just really ask them some honest questions. We encourage you to be honest with the questions that you have today. It's okay to not know the things you don't know, but this is a good time to ask questions about those things. So I'm going to start off with my friend Kendall. Kendall is with Thrive Communities. As Dennis said, she's a regional director there. And I've known Kendall for a number of years because she has served at the association in a number of capacities. She has two beautiful little daughters, which you'll get to see here in a few minutes. She's married, and this is a very passionate subject for her. She is participating in some of this work within her organization and is committed to leading the efforts of this work with the larger organization at WUMFA on behalf of our industry. So Kendall, welcome. Thank you so much for making time with us this morning. We also have Marcus Cole. Marcus is the Director of Future Leaders at Fannie Mae. And I had the real privilege of watching a previous webinar that was put on by the National Apartment Association. And Marcus was a panelist on that webinar, and he just had so much to share that was so impactful. And I am very thankful to him because I reached out right away and was like, tell us what to do, tell us how to start. I mean, how do we begin this work that is going to take so long? And he just had some very wise words for me, and was a great resource, and was happy to jump in and be part of this conversation today. So Marcus, you'll get to hear his story in just a moment, but Marcus, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And then finally is another local person that you may know. This is Greg Sorbana. Yes, we have the same last name. He happens to be in a room about 100 feet from me. He is the Vice President of Public Relations at Widener Apartment Homes. Greg has been in the industry for a very long time. He started on site as a leasing professional and has worked for a number of different companies within the market in a number of different roles. He now serves in leadership in the National Apartment Association. He is the incoming president for the Education Institute at NAA. And Greg also served on the task force for DEI at the national level, which then became a committee, which he served on for 2 years. So he has been doing this work also at a national level for us. So Greg, thank you for making time for us this morning. All right, so like I said, we're going to go ahead and just have a little bit of story time here. I'm going to have each of the panelists just share with you their story, how it relates to DEI and why it's important to them. Again, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A feature. That's on the bottom of your screen, and we will answer those as we get to the end. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start with Kendall. Kendall, take it away.
Hi guys. Well, first off, I just want to say thank you so much for just inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I think it's so important, especially in today's environment with everything that we're seeing going on. And it's just an honor and a privilege for me to be able to be a part of this conversation. So I want to say in advance, I apologize if I cry at any point. I am a crier and I'm sharing my story, so I'm going to try not to. But I think it's just really important to get very, very real. So I grew up extremely poor. I grew up as the daughter of a single mom with a serious mental illness and multiple sclerosis, which if you're not familiar is a physical disability that slowly damages your brain and nerve endings. My family history is not a proud one. You know, my grandparents grew up really poor, married in high school, lived in their car. And me as a kid, I remember going to school without clean clothes and wearing my mom's coat because mine didn't fit, and getting free lunch at school. And when I'd get home, my mom would say she wasn't hungry, but I look back now and I know there just wasn't enough to go around. So she would feed me and my little sister. She got married when I was 8 years old. I met my new dad on their wedding day, and it was a quick decision that catapulted our lives into middle class. And suddenly we lived in a house instead of an apartment, and we didn't have to hide our dog from the landlord anymore. But suddenly moving up didn't fix my discomfort around being around kids and other families with money and with educated parents and families. And what suddenly looked better in terms of my family's curb appeal was pretty harrowing inside the walls. My parents fought viciously, and my mom was abusive and really neglectful when she was ill, and my stepdad was emotionally absent, and as long as he wasn't the target, he didn't really care what happened. And after too many episodes and too many run-ins with the police, I just did whatever I could to escape. I'd seen my friends and family fall into drugs and abusive relationships, and it all just started over again, and I wanted to break that cycle. I did not want that to be my future. So I worked as hard as I could. I'd fall asleep on my books at night. I got a part-time job. I worked evenings and weekends, saved as much as I could, and I went to college, first in my family. I'm still paying off those loans. Hopefully the next couple of years that's taken care of. But I did everything I could to just get as far away as I could from my own sense of invisibility and my own sense of being less than or not good enough. And it was a journey, you know. I didn't think that, you know, even though I was there, I'd made it to college, I didn't think that business school was for people like me, right? It was for people who had leaders in their lives already and whose parents were successful and presentable. And I didn't have nice clothes, and I couldn't wear suits to class and have connections for internships. And I was ashamed to say I even wanted that life, because who was I to think that was even accessible to me? How could I even deserve that? And so I went into the next closest thing, which was the business of helping others. I studied economics and Spanish, and I moved abroad. I lived and worked in Mexico, and I volunteered at an orphanage. I taught English, and suddenly I felt like I could contribute because I was surrounded by people that I had an affinity with, people who didn't come from financial privilege, but they had drive and they wanted to do great things, and they were just doing it. And I saw leadership that came from nothing and didn't care And in their examples, I learned to see the potential in myself. So when I moved back to Seattle, I threw myself into nonprofit work. I wanted to help others. I wanted to be the example I had needed growing up. I did a year of anti-classist and anti-racist training with AmeriCorps Vista and the MLK Vista program here in King County. I raised money for social programs and services, led volunteers, created fundraisers, and worked with large businesses. And I slowly realized I can do this. And just because I came from a poor, broken, abusive background, none of that had to matter as much as I thought it did. And instead of being ashamed, I was proud of my tenacity and my strength, and I'd worked hard and it paid off. So I went back to school and I'd studied business like I'd always wanted, which is how I met Rose O'Dell, she's our president at Thrive. And that's how I met Carrie Anderson. And they pulled me into this industry that I'm so thankful to be a part of. And here I am almost 7 years later doing something I'd never thought possible. And sometimes I look in the mirror and wonder, like, what the heck happened? How did I get here? And who thought this was a good idea? But I have the great privilege and honor of being able to grow and develop the careers and opportunities of so many amazing people now in the role that I have. And I get to work with incredible potential, and I get to learn from these industry greats. And on the personal side, I'm married to an amazing immigrant man of color, and we have 2 multiracial, beautiful children. And I've learned so much from him and his family. You know, his family story is different from mine. It's a story of starting from scratch to build a business in a new country where no one initially welcomed them. It's of growing up in a rural town in central Washington and being the only Asian family around, and having his food made fun of during school lunch, and having friends who would make racist jokes but smile and laugh like, you know, I'm not really racist, because it's okay that I say that because you're my friend. And of having to fight tooth and nail for things that came easier to people who looked like they belonged. And that's been really eye-opening for me, to see what I have not had to face, and to walk through life hand in hand with my partner and my children as they navigate that experience of racism that I am insulated and protected from, despite doing nothing to earn that protection. So there's this sense of moral responsibility, of a duty to make this world a better place for my kids and for everyone. And being a white woman in an industry full of leaders who tend to look a lot like me, you know, I can pass through a room and feel like I fit in, and that's a real privilege. And I don't struggle anymore financially, and now I can take care of my loved ones in a way that they couldn't take care of me, and that's a huge privilege. And I'm in a position of leadership and decision-making power, and is immense privilege. And my ultimate desire now is to use the privilege that I have to help lift up others and to help them reach their fullest potential, to just be real and share my story, the good and the bad, and to bring great people in the door and push them up the ladder to make my company, my industry, and our community just the greatest it can be. And Sloan had asked me to speak to how far along the DEI journey I feel our industry, our multifamily industry in Washington is. And, you know, I think we're all different, right? We all have different companies. We're all in different places in this journey. And I can't speak for every company, but all I can say is, I think as leaders, we all want great people on our teams, and we all want to help them grow. And it's highly likely that we all have really good intentions and care deeply about others, regardless of their background. But where we might fall short is in the impact of our decisions due to factors we haven't considered, unconscious bias that we don't realize we have, but we know that everyone has, or factors that are completely outside of our control. And so the goal isn't to shame or criticize as we work through this and navigate this, but it's to shift our perspective to one of unlocking potential. How do we unlock the potential of our applicants and our existing associates to be better, stronger, more amazing businesses? And, I think we all agree that we want the best talent and the best ideas from anyone who has it to offer. And right now there are just some challenges to that being a reality. You know, lower income associates may have a harder time purchasing uniforms, which can hold them back, or professional wear. Associates who don't speak English well may not communicate clearly or be comfortable speaking up at a training or with leadership. And those countless little things can add up to invisible barriers that slowly reduce diversity as you get closer to the top. So I think for me, it's really about getting people thinking about this topic. And if in a way that feels proactive, safe, and inclusive for all people. And I think there's a need for data to show how the demographics differ across titles and pay scales based on different demographic factors, and how people are feeling about DEI in general. If we don't have solid info on where we're starting, then we don't necessarily know where we're going either, or how we'd like to get there. So I think it's just really important that it's an important step that we need to take as an industry, is just to figure out where are we in terms of the numbers and where would we like to be.
Thank you, Kendall. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I think what's important as we go forward is when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's tempting to think of diversity in terms of color, because from a social environment right now, that's what we're exposed to. That's what's heated. That's where we're hurting right now. But Kendall talks about growing up in poverty, having disadvantages, because of that, because of mental illness, because of physical disability of her mother. And I think that that's important to keep in mind when we talk about diversity in general. So thank you for sharing that, Kendall. All right, Marcus, I'd like to hand it over to you. Again, Marcus Cole is the Director of Future Leadership at Fannie Mae. And he's a really great story. So Marcus, take it away.
Thank you so much, Sloan. It's a pleasure to be here. Just really quickly, want to make sure everyone can hear me okay. Sloan, if you can give me a thumbs up, that's great. All right, awesome. Kendall, thank you for sharing that. I can definitely see why you would be brought to tears by sharing your story. It was tremendously heartfelt, and it's going to be hard to follow. But first things first, my name is Marcus Cole. As Sloan mentioned, I am fortunate enough to be the director of a program called Future Housing Leaders at Fannie Mae. And before that, I am a Black man from the inner city of Buffalo, New York. And my story is one in which reflects that often of a lot of young Black men. And I grew up in a single family home on the east side of Buffalo, New York, where I was surrounded by, fair share of violence, fair share of police profiling, poor education, and I even escaped the public schools to go to a private school, and was still, I guess the best word to say is really still impacted by bias of those schools. I think all of my friends were. I was told at a very young age that I wasn't smart enough, that I wasn't good enough, and that I had to do other things to essentially succeed. I'm a kid that got a 700 on his SATs. And now I'm a director with a master's degree at Fannie Mae. And all this is a reflection of where I come from. My mother was a very hardworking woman. She worked her tail off, but still, as it relates to home ownership, was vastly unprepared to have a home. We were homeowners, but we didn't maintain the home. And then shortly thereafter, we fell behind on payments. First, it was with the car, then that was repoed. And then I was fortunate enough to leverage my athletic ability and get a full scholarship to the University of Buffalo and play football, which was a great opportunity. But I spent a lot of my scholarship money helping my mother, whether that being our basement flooding, supplied scholarship money for that. Whether that be our garage collapsing after a blizzard, supplied money for that for the cleanup. So it was a very unique situation where at a very young age, I had a lot of responsibility. And that responsibility was one in which that I wasn't necessarily prepared for. But here's how it relates to kind of the D&I world. Growing up in Buffalo, there were a few things that were just norms. One, the Bills are awesome, even though we lost 4 Super Bowls in a row. And the fact that the city had lost a tremendous amount of population, and we just weren't keeping up. Mass exodus of talented students, a terrible economic situation where home ownership and housing and plight, and just we weren't keeping up with the new economy. To that end, I realized, having relatives in both Chicago, New York City, Los Angeles, when I would go to these cities, I would be like, why is the city so much more dynamic? Why is there more diversity and people kind of intermingling? And it was because of that I chose to pursue a degree in urban planning with the focus on community development. And through that degree, I moved out of Buffalo, moved to DC, and specifically targeted a nonprofit affordable housing developer who mission here in the Washington, DC metro area was to maintain affordable housing in the presence of rising rents, rising mortgages, rising land prices. And at that young age of 25, I realized early on that the disadvantages are real, predominantly for underserved communities, whether that be technology deserts, not access to internet, whether that be students that didn't have a lot of guidance, and specifically were looking for mentorship and job readiness. It was a number of those things. I say all that to say is now I've been at Fannie Mae for 10 years and I've done a number of different things. And the best thing that I did at Fannie Mae, because I will be 100% candid with everyone on the phone. I see there's 135 people coming from Buffalo, New York, being told that I couldn't compete, that I wasn't good enough. I walked into Fannie Mae knowing who they were, knowing what they stood for, and knowing that there were 10,000 people there. And immediately I had an anxiety attack. And I just thought that I'm not good enough to be here. So to make a long story short, through some projects that I worked on, I was very specific in identifying a mentor, vice presidents who looked like me, who had a similar background of me. And I developed a mentorship with a man named Ramon Richards, who is senior vice president now at Fannie Mae. And I asked him, I said, listen, I'm basically scared and I need help navigating these complex waters, the politics. I'm getting feedback that I lack professional maturity. I'm getting feedback that I'm not good enough. And it was quite frankly a eye-opening situation to me, because all this feedback was coming when, my mother surprisingly grew ill and unfortunately passed away. So I had to rely on his mentorship as an opportunity for me to do two things. One, to realize that I'm good enough, that I can show up being a Black man in this environment and be good enough. And he wanted to know that he was the example of that. And two, that I had to change my mindset and understand that I can't make things bigger than they are. So I share that story because in the D&I journey, I think it's really often that we do talk about race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability, which I think are important. And I think we can't overlook what's happening in our environment right now, particularly in 2020, post George Floyd, where corporations have become much more supportive of, and I think willing to understand the role of systemic racism. That said, as a Black man, George Floyd was just something that unfortunately happened and something that I was aware of as I was growing up. I've been profiled. I have a 10-year-old son, and we've had conversations since he was 3 years old about how to manage police. So to bring that back to where we are here in the DEI piece and why it's important, and I'm going to talk about Future Housing Leaders for a second. My goal at Future Housing Leaders and the objective of the program is to promote diversity in the housing industry. We essentially, using Fannie Mae as providers of both single family and multifamily housing, we have our hands in a vast array of housing, and we have the ability to influence. And one of the things that's important for us is we strongly, I think our performance is really based on the fact that we have a diverse workforce. We have diverse leadership in women and people of color. And if you look at the housing industry as a whole, you don't see that. 27% of the industry is racial and ethnic minority. 7% is African American, slightly above 8% is Hispanic. So there, and that number even shrinks smaller once you look at who our leadership is. So it is my goal through this program to help attract students, to promote the industry, to promote the great work that you guys are doing, and specifically allow opportunities for people who look like me and have similar opportunities, that had similar backgrounds to me, understand that you're good enough, you can make it, you can thrive. Sloan asked me to cover one thing, and that is to share some examples of the DEI program and how it's affected Fannie Mae. I will say this. If Fannie Mae was not a diverse and inclusive company, then there would be no Future Housing Leaders. We understand the importance of diversity and inclusion. I spend the majority of my time meeting with single-family residential mortgage originators and multifamily commercial lenders, developers, so forth, and explaining to them the importance of why they need to be deliberate in essentially targeting diverse students to help increase their pipeline. So with that, I'm sure there'll be questions here shortly, but Sloan, wanted to thank you for the opportunity to share my story, and looking forward to a great panel this morning.
Marcus, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I think that one of the things that Marcus, there's a couple of things that Marcus said in previous panels that I wrote down, and I want to also point this out, that our panelists provided a number of resources that are incredible. Kendall was like a whole page, so I just put them all on one page and make it a downloadable document for you. Books, blogs, articles, publications, and those are all in the additional resources tab of this class. I beg you to access that and start digging into this. And Marcus had some tremendous resources there too. So Marcus, thank you. And I know that we'll have some questions for you in a moment. All right, so last but not least, again, Greg Sterbana, he's the Vice President of Public Relations at Widener Apartment Homes. Widener Apartment Homes has communities all throughout the United States and Canada, and he does a lot of work in philanthropy and government affairs, and again, serves at a national level, and specifically has served in this arena on the DEI Task Force and Committee. Greg Sterbana.
Thank you. I very much appreciate being here, and I wanted just to make one quick note. Sloan made a comment earlier that she had heard Marcus speak on a panel and was just really enthralled by what he said and wrote a whole bunch of notes. What she didn't mention is that I was on that panel as well, and apparently I didn't really make a very large impression on her, and so she didn't write notes about me, but at least she asked me to be here and speak to you today. So. Let me just share with you a little bit, because it's a difficult conversation, I think, that we all are asked to talk about these days, but it's very necessary. And my fellow panelists have these just amazing stories, right? And I've had the opportunity to just intermingle with people within our industry and outside that have these stories about why they're so invested in this conversation. And I have to say, there are many times that I think, like several of the people, there have to be a few of you on this, not on the panel, but on this webinar right now, that may feel that they don't have a voice. They don't have a specific experience. They don't have a story to tell that has direct influence on this DE&I conversation that is going throughout our industry and throughout the world. And I would say to you, your story is yours, and it's unique. So there are some similarities between Marcus and my background. There's some similarities between Kendall, but my story is my own, and let me share that with you if I could. I have a different story. My parents are still married. They're 50 some odd years that they've been married, and I have an opportunity to see them on a regular basis, and they're hardworking, loving family, 4 kids. And I was the middle of that. My father was in the Army. He was enlisted, and he was a hard man. He had very high standards for each one of his boys and his daughter. And my mother was a school teacher, and then she was a secretary, right? And so education was important to us. But as many of you know, I grew up in Hawaii, right? Hawaii is the melting pot of the Pacific. It's a place where there's so many different cultures that they're all mixed together, right? And so gone are the days where you have pure Hawaiians. You've got people who are much like me and look like me. I've got Hawaiian and Chinese and Portuguese and Filipino in my background. And that was my friend group. That was my family group. Those are the people that we grew up around and the people that we still connect with today. So in my history, in my growing up, I grew up amongst many different people of many different backgrounds, and it added to the richness of my life. And so I didn't know any better, but we were in the Army, and so we moved to different places. We moved to Germany. Boy, that was cold. You leave Hawaii and you go to Germany, and then we moved here to Washington, and all 4 of the kids got into school, and we were lucky enough to buy a home, and my mom got a job, and we ended up staying here in Washington for many years. We call ourselves Washingtonians, even though my heart is back in Hawaii. I will say that, the question is often asked, have you felt that racism that we talk about? Have you felt being treated differently because of the way that you look? And I got to say that the answer is yes. I mean, it's unequivocal. And I think anybody who says otherwise, you know, you all have your own experience, you all have your own lives, but there are some times in experiencing those sorts of things, as Marcus says, that maybe you're not good enough, or as Kendall said, she was the free lunch kid. Well, we were the 10-cent lunch kids, right? And we were the kids that bought, you know, hand-me-downs from the next door neighbor. We were the family that made one steak or one piece of chicken go a long way, right? Because there just wasn't enough paycheck at the end of the month, right? And that's the way that we grew up. But one thing that I will say is that my parents never allowed us to feel sorry for ourselves. My parents set a high standard. And I do think that that is one of the things that differentiates myself and my story and many others from those who have had a more challenging time, is that, you know, we were taught to overcome and achieve. We were taught that despite the things that could hold you back, it was the way you woke up in the morning and the way you looked at the challenges ahead of you in that day that would allow you to move forward in a way that was allowed you to be successful. And so as I moved through my life and I saw that there were opportunities out there, I wanted to grab those opportunities. And so I fought for scholarships. I dabbled at football. I wasn't as good as Marcus, so I played in high school and that was it. I have some stories that I could tell some of y'all who are fans of the University of Washington Huskies. Yes, I did pick off Billy Joe Hobart the year that they were state champions, but yeah, we were not very good. At any rate, I sought to achieve in the classroom, and I sought to try and go to college and better myself. I sought to try and make something myself, and my goal really was achieved when I was able to go to school, when I was able to follow in my mother's footsteps. My father barely had a high school education, and so education is key. And if people don't understand that, it's become even more prominent over the last couple of years. But still, you have to find your people, right? And as I move this conversation a little bit more into our industry, I think it's important to tell you, I've been in this industry for now about 26, 27 years. I started, as Sloan said, as a leasing agent in Federal Way, Washington, a 750 unit apartment community. And much like many of you, I was there as a leasing agent, and then a month and a half later, no kidding, I was the assistant manager, right? I mean, that's what happens. You're pressed into service, and sometimes you don't have no idea what you're doing, and you're faking it until you make it, until you get somebody who teaches you and trains you and lifts you up. And Marcus's story is one of a mentor, and as was mine. Many of you know Carrie Anderson. Kendall works for her right now. I had the beauty and the privilege of working for this woman off and on professionally, and knowing her personally, for the last 27 years. And she invested into me, poured into me, and makes me feel like I need to do the same thing for others. You fast forward in my career when I worked for a REIT, and I worked for a firm locally that was a third-party management company, and now I work for an owner-operator. I've been doing that for the last 15 years. And the owner of our company, Dean Widener, poured into me and saw something that I hadn't seen before. Even though there wasn't a lot of people that looked like me in his company, he said, "You have something that I need." And he championed me, right? And so it's my responsibility to do that to others. And so I'm in this role that I'm at right now. I miss kind of what all the rest of you, or many of you, do these days. The operations, all the day-to-day stuff, all the budgets that you're doing. Actually, I don't miss that at all right about now. Many of you are taking time out from doing budgets, and I don't have to do those anymore. But I get this opportunity to work at the national level. As Sloan said, I'm on the board of directors of the National Apartment Association. I'm the incoming president of the Education Institute. But most importantly, I have a responsibility to not only my company, but to people who are looking at me to say, how can I be like him? And I realized that very early on when I was tapped on the shoulder and said, "Greg, I need your help in trying to help guide NAA to our response to this very important question about how do we become more diverse? How do we champion equity? How do we include people in there?" And so there were a number of us that were asked to be on a task force early in 2017. And we did our work in 2017, 2018 as a task force. And it became very clear that there is a business case beyond a moral case for being involved in diversity and inclusion. And research shows that companies with greater demographic diversity, they actually financially outperform their peers. It's an inclusive environment that really boosts innovation. It gets people engaged, employee engagement. That's a big buzzword that we've talked about for years. But progress has been slow in industries like ours, right? For whatever reason, we've not been able to achieve that yet, but it's starting. What we realized, however, and I'm going to share with you right now, is that effectively, if you want to do this sort of work and be engaged and have it long-term in terms of being successful, that commitment needs to start at the top. And so NAA as an organization that is just made up of affiliates all throughout the United States, of which WMFA is one of them, we realized that we had to model what we expect. And as an association at the federal level, at the national level, our goal is to try and put together a effective DE&I program that could be modeled at the local affiliates. And more importantly, is something that our member apartment communities, the ones that each one of you work for, can look at and say, perhaps we can do that, right? So I got to say, when we got involved with this work, I didn't know much about it, but surrounding myself with people who were engaged, educating myself, reading books, being a part of topics, and just talking to other folks is important. I want to share with you something. I had the opportunity at the end of the time that I was on that task force. We sunsetted our work, and we asked for it to be a standing committee at NAA. We had a couple of other recommendations. And to their credit, NAA said, yes, we're going to do this. And so I got up on stage one time and I talked about what we were doing and where we were at. And afterwards, there was probably, it was at a NAA conference, there's 10,000 people there. And in that room, there was probably 3,500 people in there. And I was scared, right? And I got done with this and I got off the stage and I was walking in the dais and this young lady ran up to me and her name is Marcy French. And Marcy is now a VP of Landis, and she works out of Florida and she covers different, who has a background like me to be represented on a stage, because I want to see myself and I want to see my peers up on that stage. I want to see myself achieving to the degree that you have. And I said to her, it took me a mentor and it took me a little courage. So Marcy and I are now friends. Marcy and I've been able to introduce her to a number of folks at the national level. She's on NAAEI faculty now. She's doing her thing. She's speaking on these panels throughout the United States. Couldn't be more proud of her. I share that with you because that is our goal and our responsibility, is to model equity. It's to model the ability for us to be diverse and to recognize the strength inherent in a wider, diverse company. I'm still not there in my company. We're working on that, but each one of us has a responsibility. In Hawaii, you call that your kuleana, your responsibility. So my responsibility is to take what I've learned, share it with those who are decision makers in my company, and incrementally, or sometimes very quickly, make the change that we want to be. So I could talk for days, but I'm going to stop right there and just thank you all for listening and allowing me to share my story.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all of you. So we do have a few questions that have come in. And again, we could talk about this for 3 hours and I still feel like I will be cutting us off short to end it at that time. But we do have a few minutes left. So I do want to get to a couple of your questions. And if time, I have a couple more questions for the panelists. But thank you to each of you. One thing that I want to say on behalf of the association is, when I started digging into this really fervently, the first, I think, awareness that I had is that this is work that is going to outlast my time at the association. If done right, this will go way past me. And so we're just really committed to doing it right. And that might mean that we make a misstep here or there. And one of the things that I've heard in talking with Marcus, and I've actually talked with Marcy French, who Greg referred to, and she's incredible. And I hope to bring her to speak with our membership at some point. And talking with Cantel and talking with Greg is, we might make a misstep here or there, but we're going to just keep admitting where we are and what we don't know, and that we're committed to moving forward. So with that, I wanted to get to a couple of questions here. One of them was, is identity part of diversity, as in regard to this topic? And I'm not sure if they're talking about sexual identity. I'm going to let the panelists answer that, but I'm assuming that that's what we're talking about here.
I can take a stab. This is Marcus.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a great question, and I think I can tell you how Fannie Mae defines diversity and how we're encouraging the industry to think about it. And that is, as I mentioned beforehand, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and perhaps that's where the identity piece comes in, considering the LGBTQ community, disability, and diversity of thought. I mean, that diversity of thought piece is really important, so it's inclusive and to really help, drive greater awareness and perspectives, and things of that nature. So that's how we define it. And I think we're still at that beginning piece of that identity, because as more people are more comfortable sharing their stories, I think we'll be able to understand that a little bit more. But I think it is included, in my opinion, yes.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. Our friends, if the question was asking specifically about our friends in the LGBTQ community, boy, how myopic of it is for us to any one person or any one background or any one history. You're looking to this panel right now. We all have 3 backgrounds, 3 histories, 3 perspectives. But how myopic for us to not to think that without reaching out to these different communities that we may not be comfortable with, may not be familiar with, may not know all about, but there's a richness to that. I'm going to go back to Hawaii. My grandmother was a great cook, but she didn't have recipes. We wanted to know what her recipes were, and grandma couldn't share that with us because then there's nothing written down. But she talked about ingredients. She said the best ingredients make the best stew, right? And so in my view, I'm looking for the best people out there. I'm looking for people with good ideas and good backgrounds and things that where I'm deficient, they're going to help my team out. And that's our goal, in my view. That's our goal. That's the reason to pursue diversity. That's the reason to have an inclusive outreach. And more importantly, it's got to be, at least from my perspective, it has to be intentional. So we have to go through this work and we have to be intentional about what we want to do and what we want to achieve. And if we bump our nose on the way, that's okay. But we have to keep moving forward.
Thank you. I want to get to this one because this really gets to something that we've been talking about the association is if we're trying to make progress, right? We want to have a better stew. Okay. So as we're sourcing candidates, how do we go about finding, are we missing opportunities to source qualified candidates of diversity? And this question comes in from one of our partners over on the east side of the mountains. She runs a property management company in Liberty Lake, Washington. Population is predominantly white, 88% of the population. When we're sourcing for options, our applicants are white. We want to be a more diverse team. Can you provide recommendations on where to source for open positions that might provide more diversity in our applicant pool, or provide recommended reading that might help me and my human resources manager in modifying our hiring practices to lead to a more diverse? This is a very thoughtful question. Thank you, Tisha, for this. I'm going to let you all take a stab at that.
I'd love to help speak to that. Those are conversations that we're having on this side of the mountains as well, and at Thrive and just within our industry. And I think we're all still figuring out what that looks like. But some of the first things that have come to mind for us is, what requirements do we have in hiring? Thrive doesn't require a 4-year degree for any of our positions, but I think we all know people who have had that story where they were turned away for not having it, right? Or are your job ads and are your posts located on sites that are only in English, or do you have opportunities for other languages? And is there opportunity for them to participate in your organization if they don't speak English well? And what sorts of resources will there be when they get there that they can really fully participate? Are they opting out before they even apply because they think that they don't have an opportunity there? So those are some things that you could potentially think through. It's hard to say exactly what sites. I'm not familiar with your particular location, but in terms of resources to just get you thinking and get you started, I think the resources that we've all provided, there's a ton of options there to start reading and just building relationships with other companies. And feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to chat and just talk about what things we're doing and share knowledge and ideas together.
Can I just drop one real quick thing in there? Our company as well has properties in let's say Wenatchee and Moses Lake and some of these smaller outlying communities. And one of the things that I think has been important for us is to be able to be sensitive to the local surrounding community because they have their own connection, their own flair their own ethos. But we've been able to bring other folks in from west of the mountains, or as we've had, our regionals, or some of our leasing agents, or some of our community directors, our interns, our managers in training over to that side of the mountain and assist us. That kind of brings a different perspective. We don't certainly want to step on people's, ideology in terms of where they were growing up, but having a more diverse person of thought is important.
And Sloan, if you don't mind, just I'd like to add as well, just because this is the work that I'm charged with from a Fannie Mae perspective. So I think there's a few ways to think about this, right? And it is, you said something that's really important, and that's the fact that 88% of your area is white. And I think it is important to note that, because it must, I think, from how you would approach this is essentially what type of diversity are you looking to influence, right? So again, diversity is broad. Is it more women? Is it more people of color? Is it someone with disabilities? So I think with such a homogenous environment, I would say I echo Greg's point, where you want to be respective of the community at large, but then within your own company, what are the things that you value? Obviously diversity, but what type of diversity? And it's okay to be specific. It's okay to target, in my opinion, because that's how you can show movement. But once you figure those things out, and I'm happy to volunteer myself as a thought partner here, there's other people that can help, like Fannie Mae. Future Housing Leaders is a free service that we provide to the industry. This is a free sourcing service. And what we do is we look to understand your needs, your D&I strategy, what your goals are, and then we try to tailor that around helping companies with their respective diversity. So that's what I'll add. I think it's a very complex and a good question. And it just has me kind of spinning across kind of what the appropriate steps would be. But I think it's heavy, but it's a certainly challenge that I'll welcome to participate in.
Yeah.
Hey, Sloan, if I can add one more thing too, I'm sorry. Marcus brings up something good, in terms of the 88% of that community being white. I mean, what we have tried to do, and we've talked about intentionally, is trying to mirror our resident base, right? Because for many of us who are in different diverse communities or background, I mentioned Federal Way before. That's where I bought my first house. That's where, we lived for many years when we were first married. It's a very diverse population. So we tried intentionally to match whatever that was in that demographic. And so, it may not absolutely happen that way in terms of the racial makeup of your employees. But in terms of diversity of thought, that's, there are different ways that we can try to achieve that.
Thank you. We are unfortunately out of time there, but here's what I want to say. We will continue this conversation. There is a discussion board in APTConnect. So we'll start some conversations there where we can continue this dialogue. And panelists, I invite you to jump in there and maybe peek at what some of the questions might be in the discussion board on this. But just know that we're going to have more of these conversations. There'll be opportunity to continue this conversation. The Washington Multifamily Housing Association is committed to making the best stew, I'm going to borrow that from Greg, here in professional property management in Washington State. And so there might be an opportunity for you to join us in that work. So I invite you, this is a passionate area for you to do that. If you have a story to contribute, please do. And remember, in one of my first conversations with Marcus, I just fell on my sword. I'm like, I don't know if I even have the right to ask questions. I'm a white straight woman. Like what questions can I ask? I mean, what opinion can I give? And what I would say to all of you that look like me is we need you too, right? We need you to be interested, to be committed to this in the industry. So this recording will be up here as soon as we have it downloaded from Zoom. Thank you again to Marcus, Kendall, and Greg for helping us just start the conversation today. We promise to keep it going. Thank you again to our friends at Zoom Drain for sponsoring this session. And we hope you'll join us for the next session, Endurance Leadership with Jessica Fern from FPI. Have a wonderful day, and thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sloan.
Thanks, Sloan.